They called her Rosalie, though no one knew if that was her real name or one stitched onto her back like a patch on old denim. The name fit her somehow soft in the mouth, sharp in the bones. She'd arrived in Dry Creek with a busted wagon and a man who swore he owned her, a man who traded her dignity for poker chips and brown bottles, until one night he sold her outright under the blistered sun-bleached sky. It happened behind the Crooked Mule Saloon, where the men spat tobacco juice and the women looked away. She stood on a rough crate, rope around her wrists, ankles raw from being tied too tight too long. Her dress was once pale blue cotton, now grimy, torn at the shoulder where he'd dragged her off the wagon like a sack of feed. The sheriff watched with dead eyes. Folks muttered that maybe she'd bewitched that bastard she came in with, made him lose every hand, made him drink himself near blind. Witch? Whore? Same thing here. When the bidding started, no one wanted to say the price out loud. So they just held up what they had. A pint of moonshine, a battered pocket watch, a half-filled tobacco pouch. The man her man pointed at each offer, weighing shame against thirst. It was Amos Kincaid who ended it. Nobody expected him to speak, let alone stand up from the far bench under the cottonwood tree, where he'd sat nursing a bottle of cheap rye since before dawn. Amos was a rancher, or used to be. Some said he was a killer once. Some said worse. Nobody asked him to his face. He rose, boots coated in red clay dust, hat brim pulled low. He looked at her, and she looked back, but neither seemed to see the other fully. Not then. He walked past the cluster of men, past the drunken cellar, and placed a full glass bottle of whiskey on the crate by her feet. Good whiskey, not the swill the saloon poured. It caught the late light like a church window catching dawn. The cellar laughed, called it fair. The rope changed hands. The sheriff pretended not to notice. The small crowd shuffled its feet and waited for the show. They figured Amos would haul her off to his broken-down ranch and spend her body dry. That was how such stories went. Instead, Amos untied her wrists, slow so the rope burn would hurt less. His fingers were cracked, knuckles raw from fence wire or old fights. He never looked her dead on. When the rope fell to the dirt, Rosalie pressed her hands to her belly like she might vanish if she didn't hold herself together. "You walk," Amos said. Voice like gravel rolled in a barrel. "Ain't gonna drag you." She stepped off the crate, nearly buckled, then righted herself. The men around them waited for some sign of what he'd do next. The cellar reached for the whiskey bottle, but Amos slid it back into his coat, untouched. He tipped his hat at no one in particular, turned his back to the crowd, and started walking west. Rosalie stared at his broad shoulders, the way he limped slightly on the left. Then she followed. Behind them, the sun slipped behind the rim of the far hills, painting the crooked town in copper and bruise. The rope lay coiled in the dirt like a dead snake, already half covered in blowing dust. No one cheered. No one stopped them. A dog barked somewhere near the livery. The saloon door banged shut behind drunken laughter. In the half-light, a child, half hidden behind her mother's skirts, pointed at the crate and asked too loud, "Mama, why was that lady standing there?" The mother shushed her, but the question hung in the air like a bullet that missed but didn't forget. They left Dry Creek with no promise, no plan. The road west was nothing but wagon ruts, half swallowed by weeds and a wind that lifted dust devils out of the dead ground like ghosts looking for something to haunt. Rosalie walked a few paces behind Amos, close enough to smell the tobacco on his coat but far enough not to breathe his breath. Each step made the rope burn sting, made her shoulder throb where the man, her man, she reminded herself, though the thought curdled her gut, had dragged her like a prize pig through the saloon door. Amos never turned to look at her. He just kept his boots moving in the same slow, deliberate beat. His hat brim hid most of his face, but now and then she caught the edge of his jaw, rough with 3 days' stubble, or the way his mouth pulled sideways when he stepped on the bad leg. Somewhere along the edge of the road, a coyote watched them pass, yellow eyes blinking in the last of the sun. They didn't speak until the sky turned black, and the stars showed themselves, timid pinholes in a velvet sheet. Amos stopped beside a stand of mesquite and dropped his bedroll with a grunt. He didn't offer it to her, just unrolled it and spread his own coat over it, like it was the most natural thing in the world to sleep under open sky with a stranger you'd bought with whiskey you never drank. "Sit," he said. "One word. No more." She lowered herself onto the cold earth, folding her legs beneath her to hide how they trembled. Her mouth tasted of iron and old shame. She wondered if he could smell it on her, that stink of being owned and sold and touched too rough by hands that thought they could claim her skin just because they paid. Amos struck a match, lit a scrap of kindling in a ring of old stones that looked like they'd been set by someone else years before. The fire flared weak and orange, shadows dancing on his boots, her bare ankles. He tossed her a canteen without ceremony. She caught it clumsy, unscrewed the top, and drank like she hadn't felt water on her tongue in a lifetime. It tasted of tin and hope. "You run?" he asked, his voice so soft she almost thought she imagined it. She looked up. His eyes were on the flames, not on her. She shook her head, though he wasn't watching for an answer. "He'd find me," she said. Her own voice startled her. It still worked. It still belonged to her. Amos spat into the dark. "Ain't gonna find you here." Rosalie's hands curled into fists in her lap, nails digging crescents into her raw palms. "Why'd you do it?" she asked. "Why buy me if you didn't want?" Her throat closed before she could finish. The words tasted dirty, like the cellar floor back at the Crooked Mule where they kept the barrels and the whores alike. Amos scraped a stick through the coals, made no eye to her. "You need it out. I had whiskey." Seemed fair. She almost laughed. It stuck in her chest, hard as a stone. She wanted to ask more where he'd come from, what he wanted, why he hadn't touched her when every man in Dry Creek would have. But the cold wind snapped through the brush, and the coyotes yipped closer now, hungry for the scraps of their fire. She curled up near the flames, her back to him, eyes wide open to the star-pricked dark. She felt his presence behind her like a wall, neither warm nor cold, just there. A shape between her and the world that had carved her up and sold her cheap. The rope burns on her wrist still stung, but she'd left the rope behind in Dry Creek, coiled like a promise that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow she'd wake up still free. When Rosalie woke, the dawn was cold enough to bite. Her breath fogged before her face, little ghosts rising and fading in the brittle air. Amos was already up, squatting by the fire he'd coaxed back to life with dry twigs and careful hands. She watched him through half-lidded eyes, the way he moved, slow but sure, like a man whose bones knew how the world would break him if he hurried. Her wrists throbbed from the rope burns. She turned them over in the early light, tracing the red welts with her thumb. Each mark was a memory. The first time the man who owned her called her witch for speaking when he was drunk. The backhand that split her lip when she said she wanted to leave. The night he dragged her through the saloon's back door, with her hair in his fist. She'd prayed once real prayers, whispered with her face pressed to the floorboards, but nothing had changed. The God she'd called to never answered. Or maybe he did, in Amos's rough boots and whiskey bottle that never opened. "Coffee," Amos said, more command than offer. He poured it black from a dented tin pot into a battered cup and held it out to her without lifting his eyes from the embers. She sat up, the blanket she'd pulled over herself slipping from her shoulders. She felt the morning wind cut through the thin cotton of her dress. She took the cup. The warmth of the metal burned her raw palms, but she didn't flinch. They sat in silence, the fire popping and hissing like it had secrets to tell but didn't trust either of them to keep them. When a breeze stirred the ashes, Rosalie saw something tucked under Amos's coat by his side, a piece of frayed rope. Not the one from Dry Creek. This one was older, grayed with age, twisted like it had been knotted and unknotted 100 times. She pointed her chin at it. "You keep trophies?" Her voice was dry as the desert beyond the hills. Amos lifted his gaze, slow. For the first time she saw his eyes clear a pale blue washed out by too much sun, too many fights, too many nights staring at nothing. He picked up the rope, held it between two fingers, like it was made of glass. "Brand rope," he said, "for calves." She knew a lie when she heard one, but she also knew when not to press. He tucked it back inside his coat and poked at the fire. Sparks leapt up, tiny stars dying before they lived. A crow landed on a mesquite branch above them, eyeing them with a black bead stare. It cawed once, sharp, like laughter in a church. "You got a place?" Amos asked, voice so low it almost vanished in the wind. She shook her head. "Not anymore." He nodded, like that was the only right answer. "Work's out west. Ranch needs hands. You work, you eat. I won't chain you to nothing." She sipped the bitter coffee, hot enough to burn her tongue. She welcomed the sting. It made her feel her mouth still belonged to her. "You trust me?" she asked. She didn't mean to. The words slipped out, shame dragging behind them like a torn hem. Amos tilted his head, looking at her like he might laugh but didn't remember how. "Don't have to trust me. Just keep up." She didn't say thank you. He didn't expect it. She just wrapped her hands tighter around the dented cup and felt the warmth seep through her cracked skin. The crow above them flapped its wings once, twice, then stayed put, like it was daring them to keep going west into the place where all things either die or learn to live again. And somewhere in her ribs, under the bruises and the half-healed cuts, Rosalie whispered a prayer she didn't believe, not to be saved, but to be strong enough to walk behind a man who paid for her freedom with a bottle he never opened. By the third day on foot, Rosalie's feet were blistered raw. The road west was no gentle welcome. It was a strip of scorched earth littered with sun-cracked bones of jackrabbits that hadn't run fast enough, stones sharp enough to bleed through cheap leather soles. She said nothing about the pain. Amos said nothing about slowing down. He only adjusted his stride when he heard her limp, just enough that she could keep the shape of his back in her view. That was his mercy, unspoken, practical. When the ranch finally rose out of the land, it looked half dead. A sagging fence line cut the scrub flat like a stitched scar. The barn leaned to one side like a drunk who'd given up pretending to stand straight. A handful of cattle grazed near a dry creek bed that gave the town its name. No water ran there now, just dust and old footprints. Amos pushed open the gate with the toe of his boot. The hinge shrieked like something in pain. Rosalie paused at the threshold, staring at the split-rail fence where someone long ago, maybe Amos himself, had hammered up a sign. The paint was faded to nothing, but she could just make out the ghost of words, Kincaid Ranch. The K was still bold, defiant somehow, the way some letters refused to rot. Inside the yard, Amos dropped his bedroll near the porch. He turned and pointed to the lean-to beside the barn. "You'll stay there," he said. "Got blankets, potbelly stove, better than the ground." She looked at the shack, more shed than shelter, its door hanging half off the hinge, its roof patched with mismatched tin and canvas. It was no palace, but it had 4 walls and no rope. That was enough. "I work here too?" she asked. She hated how her voice sounded brittle, unsure, still carrying the echo of auction blocks and drunken hands. Amos shrugged. "Ain't charity. You feed the chickens, patch fence, boil coffee when I forget. I pay you when there's money." She almost laughed. Money. The idea of coin in her palm for work done honest felt like a fairy tale told to children who'd never seen a whip or a cellar door locked from the outside. She stepped into the shed. The door squealed behind her. Inside, it smelled of hay dust and old rust. A single cot leaned against the back wall. She traced a finger over the thin blanket, feeling straw prickle her skin. She sat, boots on the dirt floor, and let her breath settle. Outside, she heard Amos moving the heavy clank of the barn door, the scrape of a shovel against dry earth. She peered through a crack in the plank wall and saw him wrestling with the fence. Each post he lifted looked like it weighed 100 pounds. But he did it with a kind of resigned grace, like penance. Sweat darkened his shirt at the shoulders and spine. Now and then he paused, hand drifting to his coat where that piece of rope lay hidden. She wondered who he'd branded, or if he'd been branded himself. By dusk, the wind picked up. Dust curled under the door, danced in thin spirals across the shed floor. Rosalie lay back on the cot, boots still on, eyes on the warped ceiling where knots in the wood formed shapes: an eye, a star, a noose if she looked too long. Somewhere beyond the fence, a calf bawled for its mother. A coyote answered, voice sharp and close. And just before sleep found her, she heard Amos outside, talking low to the cattle like they were old friends who'd listen better than people ever did. She couldn't make out the words, but the sound, a man murmuring into the dark, felt like a promise stitched into the wind. Not that things would be good, but that maybe they wouldn't always be this bad. She closed her eyes, rope burn still itching, the phantom pull of the auction crate still under her feet, and drifted off to the soft crackle of a fire Amos kept alive just outside her door. The days stacked up like poker chips nobody bothered to count. By the time Rosalie's feet hardened to the road dust, and the raw places on her wrists closed into pink scars, the ranch had taken her in the way the land takes, in a buried seed, not with kindness, but with a promise to grow if she could stand the storms. She learned quick that Amos wasn't a man of wasted words. He rose before dawn, his shape moving through the chill fog like a fence post come to life. He left black coffee by her door. Always too strong, always scalding. He pointed to tasks with the nod of his chin. The chicken coop's busted latch, the garden patch choked with burrs, the sagging corner of the barn that moaned in the wind like a ghost that wouldn't lie still. She did it all. No protest, no complaint. Her hands toughened, split at the knuckles, healed over, split again. Each cut was honest. Each bruise had no shame clinging to it. At night, she lay on the cot in the lean-to, the wind hissing through the gaps like whispered threats she didn't fear anymore. She'd catch herself drifting off with her palm over the old rope burns, feeling the ridges like reading a secret message written just for her. Still here. Still mine. One dusk, as the sun bruised the sky purple and the chickens settled restless in the roost, she found Amos by the branding pen. He stood over the iron pot, where the coals burned low, the branding iron resting across the lip like a sleeping snake. His rope was looped over the fence post beside him. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "Help me," he said. Just that. She stepped beside him, close enough to feel the heat on her shins. He lifted the iron from the coals, the hiss of it like water hitting fire. He moved slow, deliberate. In his other hand, the calf's hide trembled where his fingers pressed firm and calm. The iron sank into flesh. The smell of burning hair, scorched skin, it hit the back of Rosalie's throat, made her swallow hard. The calf didn't cry out, just shuddered, eyes wide and wet. Amos held firm. When he pulled the iron away, the mark was clear. K. Seared deep. An ugly truth that said mine in a language older than law. He dropped the iron back in the pot, steam curling up around his wrists like ghost smoke. He turned to her then, sweat shining in the creases of his neck. "You hate it?" he asked. His voice was so quiet she almost missed it under the crackle of the coals. Rosalie wiped her palms on her skirt, streaks of soot left behind like war paint. "I hate the rope more," she said. She pointed at the loop hanging by the post. "That's worse than any brand." Amos followed her gaze. He reached for the rope, rough, frayed, heavy with old memory, and for a heartbeat she thought he'd slip it around his wrist, maybe even around hers. Instead, he handed it to her. "Do what you want," he said. She took it, feeling the grit of it cut into her palms, remembering how it had bitten her skin back in Dry Creek. She looked at the branding fire, looked at Amos. Then, without a word, she dropped the rope into the glowing coals. It caught fast. The smell was bitter, acrid, sharp enough to sting her eyes. She didn't look away. Neither did Amos. The rope curled in on itself, blackening to ash and ember, until all that was left was a soft hiss and a curl of smoke twisting into the darkening sky. Neither of them spoke. Neither needed to. The brand on the calf hissed in the cold night air. The rope's ghost drifted above them, burned and buried all at once. And under the bruised sky, they stood side by side him with his scarred hands, her with her burned rope scars two shapes, refusing to kneel to the wind. The burn barrel stayed hot long after the rope turned to ash. Amos didn't say a word when the last ember winked out. He just gathered the branding iron, scraped out the coals, and left the barrel to the wind. Rosalie stood a moment longer, breathing in the charred ghost of her old binds, feeling it sink into her hair, her skin, like a mark no one could see but she'd always carry. They didn't talk about it the next day. They didn't need to. The work took the shape of their silence. Mending the fence line Amos never finished, clearing the burrs, choking the half-dead garden. When the sun climbed high enough to sting her shoulders through her thin dress, she tied Amos's old bandana around her neck to soak up the sweat. He'd left it hanging on a nail by the barn door. He didn't take it back. By dusk, storm clouds rolled up from the west, thick bellies of gray dragging ragged edges that caught the setting sun in veins of copper and coal. Rosalie stood by the chicken coop, nails clenched in her teeth, hammer in hand, watching the sky breathe its threat. Amos was in the barn, tending the calving cow that had gone lame. She could hear him murmuring low, the same way he talked to the fences, the posts, the broken parts of the ranch that needed coaxing to hold together. She stepped into the doorway, boots scuffing old straw. "You ever lose one?" she asked. Her voice carried over the heavy sigh of the wind. Amos turned from the cow, a rangy brown thing with wide, frightened eyes and a belly tight as a drum. "Sometimes you lose the best ones," he said, wiping his hands on a rag that might have been clean once. Sometimes the mean ones live forever. Rosalie stepped closer, felt the warm damp of the barn wrap around her like breath. The cow lowed deep in its throat, tail flicking at flies that didn't care a storm was coming. She reached out, palm hovering above the cow's flank. She didn't touch. She had learned not everything wants the comfort of hands. Storm will blow the roof clean off if it's mean enough, she said. That lento won't stand. Amos tilted his head. You afraid? She met his eyes, that pale blue flicker that never stayed long on hers. No, she said. I just don't want to wake up under the rain. He nodded once, as if she'd answered more than he asked. He rummaged in the tack box, pulled out an old tarp stiff with dust, and pressed it into her arms. Cover what you can. The rest'll keep or it won't. She turned to leave, but he caught her wrist gentle, just enough pressure to make her look back. His thumb brushed the inside of her wrist where the burn scar lay under the skin like a buried root. Wind'll scare the stock, he said. Don't run. I won't, she said. She almost added not any more but swallowed it down. Outside, the first fat drops fell warm against her cheeks, slicking dust to mud. She dragged the tarp over the coop, braced the planks against the rising gust. The chickens clucked in a nervous knot behind the wire. She whispered to them like Amos did to his cows, low, soft, promising nothing she couldn't keep. By nightfall, the storm came all teeth. Thunder cracked overhead like rifle fire. Rain pounded the tin roof of her lento, dripped through the gaps onto her blanket. She lay awake, boots still on, watching the corner of the shed shudder with every gust. Through the roar of rain, she thought she heard a voice, Amos, maybe, out in the yard, cursing at the wind or the fences or the part of him that still believed a broken ranch was worth the fight. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, stared at the warped ceiling where shadows flickered like ghosts dancing above her bed. The wind rattled the walls, but the roof stayed. The rope was gone. The brand still hissed on some calf's hide out in the barn, but the rope was gone. Outside, lightning split the night wide open, and for a heartbeat, Rosalie thought she saw her own shadow, standing upright in the flicker, unbound, unowned, just waiting to see what the storm would leave behind. Morning came on the tail end of the storm, the world washed raw, puddles reflecting a sky scrubbed so clean it looked like it might crack. The yard was a mess of splintered fence rails and scattered feed sacks. A chicken lay stiff near the coop door, neck snapped by fright or flying timber. Rosalie crouched over it, brushed a thumb across its cold feathers, then buried it under the mesquite where the roots might remember it kindly. Amos was already out by the far fence, shoulder braced against a post he was resetting. His coat was soaked to the elbows, mud streaked up to his knees. She watched him from the porch of the lento, steam rising from her breath in the damp chill. He worked like the storm hadn't rattled his sleep, like the wind hadn't whispered old names through the cracks in the barn. She walked out to him, boots sinking into wet earth. I'll help, she said. He didn't say no, didn't say yes either. He just shifted aside enough for her to wedge her shoulder under the beam with him. Together, they lifted it back into place, splinters biting her palms, rainwater dripping from her hair down the back of her neck. When they'd driven the last nail, Amos stood looking at the fence like it might betray him anyway. She leaned against the post, catching her breath, mud caked to her skirts. Why you stay? She asked. Sudden and sharp. She didn't mean for it to come out that way, but the words had weight and no place left to hide. He scratched his jaw, eyes drifting over the broken pasture. Land remembers, he said. A man leaves, the land don't. Might as well stay. She almost laughed, dry, cracked sound that startled a bird out of the brush. She'd been traded like a whiskey bottle, left in a dirt street like garbage. Yet here stood a man tethered to dying fence lines and barren creek beds as if they were family. She opened her mouth to press him more, but a soft voice cut the wind behind her. Mr. Kincaid? They both turned. At the gate stood a child barefoot, hair tangled, cheeks streaked with dust and dried tears. Behind him, a woman waited, older, gray scarf tied tight under her chin, eyes sunken like dry wells. Neighbors, maybe. Or drifters come to beg scraps after the storm. Amos didn't move, but Rosalie felt him stiffen beside her. The boy stepped closer, thumb tucked in the corner of his mouth. He pointed to Rosalie's small, thin arm shaking. Mama says you're a witch. The words dropped like pebbles in still water, rippling outward, soft but cutting. Rosalie felt her gut knot that word again. Spat by drunks, hissed by cowards. She braced herself for Amos to step back, to spit at her feet, to fling that word like the rope he'd burned. But before Amos could say anything, the boy's mother pushed forward, her voice cracking open in the cold air. "She ain't no witch, boy. She's a woman. Same as me, same as your grandma was." The woman's eyes flicked to Amos. "Storm broke our roof. Can we work for board?" Amos didn't answer right away. He looked down at Rosalie, a flicker in his pale eyes she couldn't name, maybe shame, maybe defiance. Then he nodded once, slow. "Plenty fence left to mend," he said. The boy stared at Rosalie, wide-eyed, thumb still buried in his mouth. She knelt in the mud, boots squelching, and reached out her hand. He flinched at first, but when her fingers touched his, he didn't pull away. The wind gusted again, carrying the smell of wet earth and wood smoke from Amos's chimney. Rosalie looked past the broken fence, past the torn-up ground, and for the first time since Dry Creek, she didn't taste rope or fear when someone said her name. Behind her, Amos cleared his throat, a rough sound that said more than any promise could. Together, they turned back to the fence line that would never quite stay mended but would stand a while longer for those who refused to run. By the time the woman and her boy settled in, the ranch began to feel less like a ruin, and more like something caught halfway between dying and growing back. The old woman, her name, turned out to be Liddy May, swept out the barn with stiff strokes that sent straw and dust wheeling into the sunbeams. Her boy, Clay, followed Rosalie like a shadow, eyes wide, always asking if she was really a witch or if she could talk to storms. She told him no, but once, when the wind shifted, she cupped his small hand in hers and let him feel it run over their skin like an invisible river. He grinned like it was magic anyway. Amos didn't say much about their staying. He gave Liddy May the spare bunk in the main house, a shack of timber that leaned heavy to the east but still held out the rain. He hammered a scrap of tin over the hole where the roof had given way. She cooked them beans that tasted of burnt salt, but warm all the same. For the first time in years, Rosalie ate food that wasn't thrown at her in anger, or tossed on a floor like scraps for a stray. Nights turned softer. Still cold, but softened by voices. Clay's small feet pattering across the porch. Liddy May's cracked hymn humming through the rafters as she stirred the pot. Amos's heavy boots pacing the yard long after dusk. Sometimes Rosalie would watch him from her lean-to door, how he circled the fence line like a wolf that never learned how to rest. Once, she stepped out barefoot into the frost-cold grass, just to stand near him without words between them. He didn't speak. Neither did she. They just listened to the cattle lowing and the wind rolling through the mesquite like a sigh that might never stop. One night, she woke to Clay standing at her cot. His hair was wild with sleep, his small hands clutching a bundle tight to his chest. "Miss Rosalie," he whispered. "It's for you." She sat up, blanket slipping to her waist. He pushed the bundle into her lap, a crooked horseshoe wrapped in burlap and tied with a bit of frayed red string. "Mama says you bury iron at the door," he said. "Keeps witches out. But I know you ain't one, so I figured you ought to keep it instead. Keeps bad things away." His voice trembled at the edges, half with sleep, half with something bigger than he knew how to say. Rosalie touched the bent metal, cool against her palm, rough with old rust. She remembered the rope, the crate in Dry Creek, the brand's hiss in the night. She looked at Clay the way his eyes searched hers for some sign that she wouldn't disappear before morning. She leaned down, pressed the crooked horseshoe into the dirt just inside her door. "We'll let it guard the whole ranch," she said. Clay nodded, sleepy smile flickering like a candle flame. "You ain't gonna leave, right?" She pulled him close, felt his small bones under her hands, so light he might blow away if the wind wanted him bad enough. "Not tonight," she said. "Not tomorrow either." When he stumbled back toward the main house, Rosalie sat there on the threshold, bare toes pressed to cold dirt, hand resting on the buried iron. The wind rattled the boards overhead. Far off, an owl called out 3 slow notes like a question only the dark could answer. Inside, she curled back onto her cot, pulling the thin blanket tight under her chin. The smell of rain and turned earth drifted through the crack in the door. The rope was gone, burned to nothing. But this bent bit of iron, tucked in the soil, like a promise that would stay. And when she drifted off, she dreamed not of auctions or ropes or crates, but of a patch of fence that never quite broke, no matter how hard the storm howled. Spring crept up slow that year, like it was testing the ranch to see if it deserved a softer wind. The creek stayed dry, but green pushed through the old fence line in patches, stubborn weeds. Sure, but life all the same. The chickens laid enough eggs to trade in town, and Liddy Mae's rough stew didn't taste quite so burnt once she found Amos's hidden stash of old herbs in the cellar. Clay grew bolder every day, trailing Rosalie through the pasture, carrying nails in his pockets, mimicking the way Amos walked with that slight limp that told 100 stories Rosalie still hadn't heard. One afternoon, the three of them stood together by the far fence where the posts leaned into the wind like drunks at a bar. Rosalie hammered nails while Clay fetched them one by one, his hands smudged with dirt and pride. Amos leaned on the fence, watching her more than the work. She felt his gaze before she lifted her eyes to meet it. Something in him had softened, not gentled exactly, but cracked open enough to let the wind blow through without splintering the whole frame. "You could go," he said suddenly. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact laid bare like a bone in the sun. "Town's only a day's walk. You could leave it all behind." Rosalie wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, rope scars long healed into pale ridges. She glanced at Clay, who pretended not to hear but stood still, ears sharp as a coyote's. "I could," she said. She drove the last nail in with one hard strike, "but I don't want to." Amos's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close enough that it made her chest tighten in a way that scared her more than any rope ever had. He pushed off the fence, boots sinking in soft mud, where spring melt had given the ground back its pulse. "I ain't your keeper, Rosalie," he said. His voice cracked like old leather. Never was. She stepped closer, so near she could smell the sweat and earth on him, that faint tang of tobacco that clung to the seams of his coat. She laid her palm flat against his chest, felt the thrum of his heart under rough cotton. A man's heart. A man who'd bought her freedom for a bottle he never uncorked. "You never kept me," she said. "You gave me room to stay." For a moment, she thought he might pull her close. Instead, Amos just covered her hand with his own, bigger, calloused, warm like a brand that didn't burn but marked all the same. Behind them, Clay's small voice piped up, stubborn in the hush. "Miss Rosalie, is Mr. Amos your husband now?" Neither of them laughed. Neither said yes or no. They just looked at each other and let the wind fill the space between. That night, Rosalie dug in the garden behind the lento just a small patch of turned dirt, where the sun hit long enough to coax seeds awake. She pressed the last root down into the soft earth, her fingers stained black with wet soil. Beside her, she planted the crooked horseshoe Clay had given her. Half-buried, half-seen iron and root tangled together like a quiet promise that what gets bent doesn't always stay broken. As dusk slid its blue hand over the yard, she stood up, wiped her palms on her dress, and looked out across the fence line. Amos was there, shape cut dark against the last scrap of light. He tipped his hat, not a wave, not a call, just that small tilt that meant, "I see you." And for the first time in years, Rosalie felt no rope around her wrists, no crate under her feet, no crowd watching her shame, just soft earth under her boots, and the taste of something slow and sure blooming where the wind carried her prayers. Summer came like a hush, no rain but enough sun to keep the small garden alive. Clay's laughter carried across the yard at dusk, while Liddy Mae's voice drifted from the kitchen window, singing hymns half forgotten, even to her own tongue. Amos mended what he could, fence rails, broken hinges, old grudges buried in the dust. And Rosalie, who had once been traded for whiskey, found her hands full of seeds instead of shackles. One morning, the sky was low and gray, the air heavy with heat that never broke. Rosalie found herself near the edge of the pasture, staring at the far fence line where the land sloped into a dry ravine. She'd wandered there with Clay chasing grasshoppers, but when he ran off to chase a calf instead, she stayed, drawn by something older than memory. At the fence post, she saw it, half buried under wind-blown dirt, a coil of old rope, sun-bleached, frayed to split ends. The sight of it punched the breath out of her chest. A ghost of Dry Creek. A reminder of what hands could do when they claimed a body that wasn't theirs to claim. She knelt, fingers trembling, brushed the dust away. The rope smelled of earth and old storms. She could have left it, could have turned away. But some things want burying right. so they don't claw their way back in the dark. When Amos found her, she was still there, mud on her knees, rope in her lap like a dead snake she'd caught and needed proof of. He crouched beside her, the old bones in his knee popping like fence posts settling. "Rope, don't own you," he said. "Not a question, not pity, just a truth laid down between them like an iron nail." Rosalie didn't look at him. She traced the frayed ends with her thumb. "Ain't about owning. It's about forgetting." He tilted his head, brow furrowed, under the brim of his hat. "You want it gone?" She nodded. Words stuck in her throat, like dry bread. Amos took the rope from her lap. He didn't toss it aside like trash. He held it gentle, like something that could still bite. "Come on," he said. He stood, offered her his hand. She took it. Together, they walked back to the yard, Clay trailing behind them with a calf's lead rope looped in his small fist. Amos dug a pit behind the lento deep enough the coyotes wouldn't bother sniffing after the scent of old fear. Rosalie watched as he laid the rope in the hole, coiled neat as if it deserved that small dignity. Then he handed her the spade. She filled the pit herself, dirt falling soft over the frayed hemp, packing down years of shame, hands steady. When it was done, she pressed her palm flat to the fresh mound. Above her, the garden she'd started trembled green against the wind, root and iron, seed and scar. That night, when the sky cracked open with stars, she sat on the porch of the linto, her knees tucked to her chest. Amos sat beside her, not touching, but near enough she felt the warmth where his arm brushed hers. Clay slept inside with Liddy May humming over him like a promise that nothing bad would cross their threshold while she breathed. They sat like that until the crickets rose up from the grass, until the wind quieted down enough to let them hear the ranch's soft heartbeat, wood creaking, cattle shifting in the dark, the hush of a world that had tried to break them but hadn't finished the job. Rosalie looked at Amos, at the pale eyes that never flinched from hers anymore. She laid her head on his shoulder, felt his breath catch once before, settling calm and true. She didn't know if they were saved. She didn't believe in that word much anymore. But she knew this. The rope was buried. The fence still stood. And the garden, small and stubborn, pushed its green hope through dry dirt that remembered too much, but gave back just enough to keep them. Some nights she'd wake, breath caught in her throat, half dreaming of auction crates and dirt streets. And when she did, she'd slip out barefoot to the garden, press her palm to the mound where the last rope lay sleeping under roots and iron. She'd whisper a name to the wind, her own name, whole and unclaimed, and the land would carry it past the fence line, past the ravine, into the dark where even the worst things get quiet. And somewhere under the hush of that wide, forgiving sky, she'd remind herself, some scars stay, but so do seeds. And so do those who choose not to run when the wind comes hard. So goes the folktale by the fire. Some things get buried. Some things grow. And some souls bent, burned, half-branded live on anyway.